I welcome you all on behalf of KLF, and we're extremely privileged and excited to have with us Sinan Antoon, who is an acclaimed Iraqi poet, novelist, scholar, and translator. It's a little difficult to call him a writer of Iraqi origin or Iraqi born, even though he has lived more years of his life outside Iraq now. Am I right? Because he has stayed connected with the country of his birth through his writing. Sinan was born and raised in Baghdad, a city he left after the Gulf War in 1991 to live in the United States. Today, he lives in New York and is an associate professor at the New York University. So, about the conversation that we are going to have today between the Arab and the Anglophone world. So, Sinan, what do you make of this title? I don't know what it means except to describe the dilemma of people or writers from the Arab world who are now living in exile in the English-speaking world. So, and they are somehow connecting with it through language. So, do you feel this dilemma, this sense of uprootedness, especially when you live in a country that's somehow responsible also for the tragedy that's happening in the country of your birth? So what's your sense about this?
Well, can you all hear me? Well, thank you first so much for agreeing to be the interlocutor. Thank you all for coming. I'm honored and delighted to be in this city and for you all to come. I think, as you said, the title was chosen because I occupy the odd position of having lived in New York in the United States for 30 years, but still writing mostly in Arabic. I translate my own work into English, but I primarily write in Arabic. So in a way, although the works have been translated into English, but as I jokingly or seriously say, my constituency is mostly in the Arab world.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I should say that, unfortunately, and I'm sure you all know, a disproportionate number of writers and artists from the Arab world live outside, especially from countries like Iraq and Syria because of the dictatorship, because of the wars. And particularly in Iraq, because of the successive dictatorships and wars, actually almost 75% of Iraqi artists and writers don't live in Iraq because of Saddam's dictatorship in the beginning. And then in 1991, we had the so-called first Gulf War. And after that, it was followed by economic sanctions for 13 years that really destroyed the social fabric and drove most writers abroad, and I'm just one of those. But living, as you said, going to the country that first supported the dictator who ruled us for so long, and then bombed my country several times, and also living in a society where that is so detached. Most Americans, and I'm sure you all know this, are so detached from the wars that their country was waging and is still waging, and uninformed about the heavy presence of the US abroad. So, and being a professor of Middle Eastern studies, I was often called upon to respond to all of this. But of course, mainstream media, the corporate media in the United States, is not interested in critical voices. So they want someone who sings with the chorus. And there is another problem in that literature, translated literature from the global south in the United States and England and Europe, primarily is not really treated as literature for its aesthetic purposes, right? So when they review our novels, they focus only on the politics. Or when they interview us, they don't ask us questions about aesthetics and literature. So we all become native informants, whether we like it or not. So that's, I can go on for a whole hour, but but we don't want that.
No. I think that's a good start. So I must confess that I haven't read Sinan's novels, all of them, but I have read some of his poetry. And I mean, completely flawed, and it's really impressive. So to kick off today's session, may we request Sinan to recite a few of your poems for us, for the KLF audience, and then we are going to talk about some of the other genres that you're writing.
Gladly, yes.
Thank you.
I will read. There's a collection coming out from Seagull Press, which is based in India, which I translated myself from Arabic into English. Most of the poems deal with, the human condition, but the effects of war on human beings. But in this collection, most of which was published in Arabic, the language tries to play with the rhetoric and the discourse of the Old Testament. So I'm going to start with a poem called Psalm. In the beginning was the stab. The dagger made the wound in its own image. Yeah. Then it went away, searching for another body. The wound wept for 40 days, and then it healed and became a heart and crawled away, searching for another body. And since the topic of climate justice, or injustice rather, is current now, this poem is called The Day, kind of about the dystopia that we're living. Mm-hmm. And then the day came when the earth was spent and overbled. It lost its gravity. Tree leaves stopped falling. Dead birds too. Their corpses kept flying up into the gray sky, which had become a colossal screen of the underworld. And the third one is called A Heavy Heart. I have finally understood that the heart is a box. I can empty its sorrow and fill it up with joy whenever I wish. I don't always succeed. At times, it becomes too heavy to carry. So I put it aside and lean on it. And then I get up and carry it again. To be fair, there are times when it's quite light. It spreads its wings and soars, reminding me that I am its nest. But these are the requisite illusions for a poem. The truth is this: the heart is a long shelf stacked with heavy boxes. No wings, just dust and pain. I lied again for the poem's sake, of course. But since we are approaching the last few lines, I will come clean. I know nothing about your hearts, but I do know that mine is an old palace, so vast I used to wander and get lost in it. Today, its rooms and corners are stacked with hundreds of boxes. There is not much space left, except for this narrow spot by the gate, where I squat and write this poem.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So it's generally understood that exile poetry is going to be all about resistance, but this is very deep and haunting, and it's about preservation of memory, and it's about the tragedy of a country. And so at times I feel that there's a darkness, but there's also a playfulness along with that darkness. So how do you do it? What is it, what is it in that moment that makes you feel like writing a poem? So can you pinpoint that something that makes you write a poem that compels you, or it just happens? Tell us about the process.
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I should say that we were talking before the beginning about how it's heartwarming to come to a country and a region where poetry still matters and poetry readings attract larger audiences. Poetry seems to have this way of channeling very intense and complicated emotions And for me, growing up in Iraq, as elsewhere in the Arab world, poetry is the primary form of expression and a highly valued channel. And also in trying to process what we lived through, whether it's all the human emotions, the spectrum of pain and sadness that one has, but also living through dictatorship. It was poetry, the poems that we had inherited that were written centuries ago, as you have, but also the poems written in exile by Iraqi poets, which spoke of resistance. So it was also, poetry was a space to give an alternative narrative of history. Because in a country where culture was controlled, that we had hundreds of Arab and Iraqi poets praising the great leader. But as a teenager, I intuitively thought there was something wrong. And having those poems written by poets in exile, they were like a compass for me. But how does the poem start? I mean, it's just an image or a sense, but it's about a desire to write, and about the playfulness also. I think whether it's how we survive this world and its cruelty and its tragedy is oftentimes with comedy and with realizing that it's absurd. So in dictatorships, and I lived under one for 23 years. Despite the fact that there were laws against cracking jokes, but people had to make fun of the absurdity they live every day as a coping mechanism. And in a way, our whole existence is tragicomic, so that's why sometimes the playfulness comes around also, I think, from the realization that the poem itself is mediating that reality. But recently a journalist from Lebanon asked me, where do poems come from? And I told him if I knew where they came from, I would go there and never come back. But no, so I should say there is this, inspiration is something very serious. I know it's a cliche, but in the pre-Islamic Arab poets, there was a belief that every poet had a certain spirit that guided them. And I think even in the modern period, in the European tradition, that was replaced by the unconscious. But somehow poets and artists and others have glimpses of this beyond that we try to reach with language. And we fail, of course, but in our failure, we try to produce something beautiful.
And you're writing in 2 languages?
I mostly write in Arabic. I mean, sometimes I write in English, some poems in English, but mostly I write in Arabic because I feel more at home in Arabic, and I'm old enough to have lived the pre-digital age. And frankly, when I first went from Iraq to the United States in 1991, there was no Twitter, no social media, no satellite channels, and the feeling of not seeing the letters of the language your mother tongue, and not hearing it was very strong sense. And in a way, I write in Arabic because I also don't want to lose the vast audiences who live in the Arab world and who don't have access to English. And and there is another subject that's a touchy subject, which is, of course, when one writes and publishes in English, one gets a wider audience, but oftentimes the language you choose to speak or write in imposes certain structures unconsciously on you, and you end up writing for a certain audience rather than just writing in general. So I don't want to fall into that trap.
Okay, fair enough. So I also want to talk about your novels and your translation work, but first of all, I want to ask you a general question about writing. And I was reading in one of your interviews where you've quoted an Egyptian writer, Yusuf Idris, that writing is the most difficult profession. Yes. So tell us about the process, and tell us what are the more difficult parts, the less difficult parts, the more rewarding parts, and how do you shift between genres?
Yes, I mean, that reference was when I was 16, as with all teenagers. I read this quote by this very important, great Egyptian writer, Yusuf Idris, who had this quote saying, writing is the most difficult profession in the world. And I just said, this is so silly, it's so ridiculous. But every time I sit down to write anything, even if it's a 200-word abstract or whether something creative or academic, I remember him because writing might not be physically cumbersome, but it's very difficult, especially in the 21st century, to think that one will write something and add to the piles and piles and millions of words that are out there. So it takes a certain conviction and a certain commitment. But it's also, I waver like so many between what I just talked about, inspiration, but also realizing that it's about rituals, it's about sitting down and not waiting for inspiration. So I still struggle with it every day. It's also because it's difficult that I'm an academic, so I have to do my teaching, and sometimes it's a challenge to switch from academic discourse into creative writing. So I try as much as possible to make it a daily ritual, but it doesn't always work.
Okay, good. So you've also written 4 novels, and even though you've talked about how the novels are judged and the writing is judged in the context of its politics, but I felt that your novels are about people who have been impacted by the times, the politics, and there seem like autobiographical elements in them, and there are actual real political events and people. For instance, I was reading the Baghdad Eucharist, and there's the character of Tariq Aziz in it, and the characters are discussing it. So what do you think about that, and how do you write your novels? What role does politics play in it? Is it an idea, an image? What starts it?
I'm happy you brought that up. I have to preface my answer with this, just a few words about, I came of age in the 80s and the 90s. And the global situation of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called New World Order and the rise of neoliberalism and this notion of the end of history, many writers, especially in our part of the world, my part of the world, kind of in reaction to propaganda literature and writings that are affiliated with certain parties and platforms, there was this notion that you just completely abandon politics and just write about individual desires and fears. But that has to do with a misunderstanding of what politics means. I, of course, don't like, and I'm disgusted by, platform writing that screams and just says, this is how it is. But on the other hand, I believe that politics exists everywhere in the world. Because politics is about power. So, and having grown up under a dictatorship for 23 years, where there was a lot of censorship, and where, for example, as I said before, in the pre-digital age, when I wanted so much to have a poem published in the daily newspaper, during the war with Iran, I took my poems to the literary editor. He said, you are very talented, but we have a war going on and we have to talk about martyrs, and the mother can't cry, she has to be happy when her son comes back in a coffin. And I was devastated because I wanted my poems to be out there. But I am happy to say, without tooting my horn, that I went back home and I didn't publish anything because I didn't want to be part of this chorus. But then being from Iraq and having lived under dictatorship and war, and having seen neighbors and classmates die or be taken into prison, I cannot but write about those people also. Now there is a tendency, especially in the Arab novels, to always have, not always, but mostly an upper middle class intellectual who is very enamored with Europe, and that's fine. There are people like that, but I am more concerned with everyday people who are born into situations that are very difficult, not of their choice,
Yeah.
and who are maybe very talented and very hardworking, but they don't always succeed in this capitalist dream of upward mobility.
Yeah.
I mean, millions and millions of people around the world do their job very well every day, and they go on because they're committed. So that's why in 2005, I had finished my PhD, which took me 9 years, so I had time to write a novel. And by then, the US was occupying Iraq, and there was a civil war going on, and there was a lot of death. So it was challenging. How do you write about a place? Same thing goes for Syria or other places. And I was lucky, I came across a newspaper article about a corpse washer.
Yeah.
And it was about a person from a family of corpse washers in in Najaf, whose job was to wash corpses. And he was making a lot of money because so many people were dying, but he wanted to quit this job because he didn't want his son to inherit this. And the story moved me so much, and because you asked how does it happen?
Yeah.
Although I don't always believe in gut feeling, but my gut feeling was that I will write a novel about a corpse washer. And then I changed things around, and I was surprised that no Iraqi writer, or for that matter, not any Muslim writers, where this corpse washing tradition had written about this. And this takes us back to the being enamored. And again, I love Borges, I love so many other writers, but also in our own societies and in our own literary traditions, there is such a wealth that is not used. So to go back to, the corpse washer is from a working class family in my novel, and he grows up in this family of corpse washers, but he, as we always have, has a family generational conflict. He doesn't want to be a corpse washer, he wants to be an artist. His father frowns upon this because he's from a conservative family, and the son does not understand what this profession means. Studies art in Baghdad like so many people did, but then with the war and sanctions, he cannot live as an artist. And his father dies, and he's forced to go back and do the very same job that his father did. But in doing it, he understands that even though he might not fully understand or believe in the religious dimension, but he understands that these rituals, this is an art form as well. Mm-hmm. But the structure and the character of Jawad allowed me also to give a panoramic view of the last 3 decades of Iraqi history and what happened to a whole generation. To go back to my earlier point that very talented people, very hardworking, but are imprisoned in history in a way.
Yeah. So, and one of your novels is called The Book of Collateral Damage. And you've said in your interviews that you were very fascinated, or I don't know, interested in the idea of collateral damage, and tell us something about it.
No, I mean, again, sorry to always speak from personal experience, but this is what we're inspired by. When I left Iraq in 1991, the US bombed Iraq for a month and a half. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have water, we only had the radio. And we lived in shelters for a month and a half. And then when I went to the US, I watched how the war was filmed on CNN. And that was called the first TV war. Then I realized, of course, we didn't exist. Civilians who die don't exist. And it's with that war also that you have in the media complete identification with the soldiers. So the Americans and the whole world saw the war from the perspective of the bomber. And in addition to that, the language they used to describe the bombing of Baghdad was barbaric. So one of them said, the Baghdad sky lit up like a Christmas tree. So then I realized that, once again, I'd like to write only about butterflies and the sea, but so what about all of those of us who lived for a month and a half in the shelter thinking I might die the next minute or not, and it all depends if the American pilot makes a mistake. And then also in reading more about how history is always the memory of the defeated is forgotten and erased, and It's a cliche, but it's true. History is written by the victor. But also, I came across this notion of collateral damage. So, the American army uses this, and now it's used worldwide.
Yeah.
Collateral damage is basically this category that I describe as like a black hole. So, humans, houses, belongings,
Yeah.
flora and fauna all become collateral damage.
Yeah.
And then there are statistics. And worse than that, in the last war, the Americans only count their dead. So Iraqis don't count. And the same goes for all those others who are killed by drones everywhere, and later we discover that they're actually just going to pray or going to a wedding. So I was haunted by this idea of, how do we also calculate or come to terms with what is destroyed by war? Because those who wage the war don't tell us.
Yeah.
So, and then I had, the idea of a bookseller in Baghdad
Yeah.
who is haunted by this notion, and he wants to write the history of war, minute by minute, also not only from the perspective of humans, but animals, objects. But of course, it's an impossible project. And as we read the novel, we discover that he himself is a victim of a previous war. But that's the structure of the novel, is also about objects and animals and trees all narrate their history and how they were all destroyed in 1 minute. So
very interesting. So while we're on the subject of novel, would you like to read an excerpt from one of your novels for our audience?
Sure. I will read from the novel that I spoke of earlier, The Corpse Washer. It's actually in Arabic, it's called The Pomegranate Alone.
Yeah.
Because the pomegranate, in the rituals of corpse washing, after shrouding, a branch of a pomegranate tree or a palm tree is put with the American publisher. It's always a tug of war with American publishers when translations, because they want to change so much, especially the titles. And he insisted on changing it into The Corpse Washer, which I was against, but it was a compromise. Because the French version is not changed and all the others are not changed. But I'll read an excerpt from where the son inherits his father's profession, and of course there is this turmoil because he's not a total believer, and he was trained to be an artist, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. So death is not content with what it takes from me in my waking hours. It insists on haunting me even in my sleep. Isn't it enough that I toil all day tending to its eternal guests, preparing them to sleep in its lap? Is death punishing me because I thought I could escape away from its clutches? If my father were still alive, he would mock me and my silly thoughts. He would dismiss all of this as infantile, unbecoming to a man. Didn't he spend a lifetime doing his job day after day, never once complaining of death? But death back then was timid and more measured than today. I can almost hear death saying, I am what I am and I haven't changed at all. I am but a postman. If death is a postman, then I am one of those who receive his letters every day. I am the one who reopens them carefully from their bloodied and torn envelopes. I am the one who washes them, who removes the stamps of death and dries and perfumes them, mumbling what I don't entirely believe in. Then I wrap them carefully in white so they may reach their final reader, the grave. But letters are piling up, Father, tenfold more than what you used to see in the span of a week, now pass before me in a day or two. If you were alive, Father, would you say that this is fate and God's will? I wish you were here so I could leave Mother with you and escape without feeling guilty. You were heavily armed with faith, and that made your heart a fortified castle. My heart, by contrast, is an abandoned house whose windows are shattered and doors unhinged. Ghosts play inside it, and the winds wail.
Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about translation now, and since you've read this excerpt, this is one novel that you translated yourself. Yeah. So, so what do you think is lost in translation, and does it help to know both languages? And for your other novels, do you collaborate with the translator, or do you let them do it?
Yes, so this question always comes up, what is lost in translation?
Yeah.
And for those of us who know the original language and read the translation, we realize that something is always lost, for sure.
Yeah.
But where would we be without translation, in a way? And some of the most fascinating aspects of human civilization were born out of translations and interactions. So, and I mentioned earlier all the people in the Arab world who don't read English, and all the people in Pakistan who don't read English. They need or want and desire to read in translation, and translation is difficult and tough, but I think it's an art. And one of my favorite Iraqi poets who translated a great deal from English to Arabic has this brilliant definition where he says poetry is what's left after translation. Because we read a lot. I don't know Spanish or French, but I read, or Portuguese, and I read poems translated into Arabic or English, and I have a pang in my heart, and I'm almost about to cry. So not much is lost, for sure. Now, one thing is lost for sure is the dialects.
Yeah.
So in the Arab world, as you all know, there are all these different local languages and dialects in Pakistan and India, but in the Arab world there is a certain gap between the modern standard Arabic that's used in the news and in the narrative and the local dialects. And many Arab writers write their dialogue of their characters in the modern standard Arabic, which to my ears sounds very jarring, because then everyone, if they're from the south or the north of the country, if they're working class or philosophers, they all speak the same way. In my novels, because I also always relish the variety in every country where I live, but in Iraq we have different dialects from the north and the south, and I can't have the various characters all speak the Baghdad dialect or speak formal Arabic, because then it would sound like it's one of those dubbed series on TV. Now that's impossible to translate into English, so that's definitely lost. And then there are some, few expressions from popular culture or few expressions, religious expressions, that in English just lose a lot of their resonance. But that's unavoidable.
Yes.
But I think, I do think that translation is an art, and it's not just a mechanical process with literary translation. And of course, it helps me that I'm translating from my mother tongue, which is Arabic, into a language that I've studied and in a country where I've lived for 30 years. So.
Yeah. So I want to dwell a little more on it, because I completely understand that you rate translation very high, and I've read in one of your interviews you've said that translation is an act of preservation, and it's a creative act, and it's something that transports beauty from one cultural sphere to another, and it was something new for me, because till now, I have thought of translation as something very important, something that needs to be very professionally done, and the translator needs to know the intricacies of both languages. But to actually call it a creative act, that's been a game changer for me, right? So it is a creative act.
It is a creative act, and it's an act of resistance. I know resistance is thrown around too often, where it almost loses its meaning. But let me give you a concrete example. After 9/11, especially in the U.S., but then we know that U.S. culture influenced the entire world. There's this whole focus on Islam and violence.
Yeah.
And that, that somehow 9/11 is a product of culture. It's what's his name? I forgot his name, the scholar of Columbia, but the culture talk. So instead of talking about foreign policy and history, there was this focus on culture. And I remember back then, so all of a sudden, sales of Quran went up in the US because people thought that since bin Laden's quoting the Quran, if we read the Quran, we'll understand 9/11.
Yeah.
And at my university, I teach a course on the Quran as a cultural text, and I have a lot of students, and on the first day I tell them, if you're here to understand 9/11, please drop this course and go do political science. So sadly, we have to do this, and all, same thing for Iraq. In the US, they think Iraq is suicide bombings and dictators. And there is that, of course, but frankly, we have a culture that's 14 centuries, and we have tons of art and tons of poetry, as you do here.
Yeah.
So translating for me was to whether it's from Iraqi poets or Palestinian poets, to show, frankly, largely ignorant Western audiences. And I don't blame people for their ignorance if they have no way to remedy that. But I'm speaking of the liberal elites in the United States and Europe who assume somehow that there is no culture.
Yeah.
So translating Iraqi and Arab poets was to give them a window into seeing and feeling and sensing that I allow myself to say, we produce poetry, produce beauty, we are talented like everyone else, and we are not, we weren't always a war zone.
Yeah.
How geography is turned into a war zone and it's assumed to be just a place where death takes place, it removes who turned it into as such.
Exactly.
And why we're speaking English now, and don't get me wrong, I love English, were it not for colonialism and the British Empire, we would probably be speaking some other language. So that's where it becomes an act of resistance, because some of you might not believe it, but there is vast ignorance of, and not giving the benefit of the doubt or assuming that every place has culture. I just give you one example. In 2005 at a conference, an art historian at the University of Texas said, well, is there modern art in Iraq? And not because I'm from that country, but it also speaks to the ignorance of history, is that, actually in Iraq in the 1950s, we had the birth of the modern poetry in Arabic, going against the meters of the qasida. We had also a very burgeoning art movement, and it was at the forefront for very objective material reasons, starting in the 20s. But so I unfortunately have to be strategic in what I translate, and so yes, it's a very, very important act. And this is where one last thing I say is the politics of the international market of literature is very problematic also, because oftentimes the publishing houses, of course, they want to sell, and they're in search of novels that confirm the stereotypes they have.
Yeah.
So many covers of novels translated from Arabic have to have a veil and have to have some mystery and have to, and not that I don't believe that literature and culture opens a window, but it's also used for what I call forensic interest. So, like, okay, or a professor approaches me from my university, tells me, so give me one novel for me to understand Egypt, as if a country of 90 million people can be summarized in one novel.
Yeah, so we'll come to
sorry,
that.
I'm venting here.
No, exactly. This is very interesting, and I want to come back to it. But before that, I just want to get a little reply from you. And you've also translated Mahmoud Darwish into English.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that experience.
I mean, Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, does not need my endorsement. He's probably one of the most important poets to have written in the last 50 years. But what fascinates me about him is that he grew up in Palestine under Israeli occupation, where culture was being erased, and he was one of those Palestinian citizens of Israel. But he wrote poems that were resistance poems, which were about, I exist, I am an Arab, I exist, one of his most famous poems. And then he became the national poet. But so much pressure was put on him as a national poet, but he resisted that throughout his career and kept also reinventing himself and his poetry. So he was true to the politics, but also true to not being pigeonholed into just the national poet like so many others. So he ended up innovating Arabic poetry and taking it to new heights, and that's why I translate him, because I enjoy it also, but also to learn, because translation is also an internalization of the style, but to show the development of also how one deals with a country that's lost, that the Palestine he grew up in doesn't exist anymore, not the way it used to.
Thank you for doing that. So how much time do we have? 15 minutes, so I got a little confused. So, there's now, I want to talk a little bit about politics, and I also want to, because I was reading this novel, and it seeed to me that the entire, maybe Muslim world, if not the entire world, has not solved the minority question, it seems. And we get to see a lot of this in Pakistan as a country that was created in the name of a religion. But I was reading about the exodus of Yusuf's Jewish friend in your novel, and the persecution of Christians in Iraq. So how do you look at it? You know, is it the treatment of minorities? Is it tied with the geopolitics, or is it something else with a Muslim majority country?
No, that's an excellent question. And I grew up in a Christian family as a Christian in Iraq. So one reason why I wrote this novel, actually, The Baghdad Eucharist, about a Christian family, I initially didn't want to, keep writing Christian man writes novels about Christian families. But after a bombing of a church in Baghdad, I noticed how some of my extended relatives and younger Iraqi Christians and Iraqis in the diaspora had internalized this Islamophobia, but also this notion of eternal minorities, and were thinking that the reasons are purely in the religious texts themselves. And sadly, this is common amongst a lot of Muslims. I personally don't think it's in the religion itself. It's in the way religion is deployed as a rhetoric for politics. So that's why I wrote the novel. Has two characters. One is an older man who had lived a time, and I should say, this doesn't mean that there was no discrimination. There is always discrimination against minorities everywhere in the world, even in the United States. But of course, there are laws to protect them. But there is a difference between tensions between minorities and people being killed for being minorities. So the bombing of the church in Iraq, even though I'm not a religious person, not even a believer, but was very shocking to me, because this was the first time that a church was bombed in hundreds of years, actually, in almost 1,300 years. So one has to understand that it's intellectual laziness to say, oh, they hate us, they always wanted to kill us. I mean, that's what, and I understand the suffering of Christian minorities in Egypt and Iraq and Syria. But to say they always wanted to kill us, I mean, my response, which is half serious, but if they always trying to kill us, how come we survived for 1,300 years? And I don't want to use the we. But through my experience and the experience of a previous generation in Iraq, we also have to think of history in changing categories. There is something called nationalism. There's not only just religion and sect. There are moments, so during the Iran-Iraq war, for 8 years, because nationalism was so strong, Iraqi Shiites were going to the Iraqi military and killing Shiite Iranians, because their sense of Iraqiness was much stronger than the other sense. So I believe in that it's primarily geopolitics. So that's why I wrote the novel, which is two characters from the same family, but one of them believes that it's geopolitics and it will pass, because he lived, which is a time I witnessed in the 70s, and now I'm dating myself. But at the time when I grew up in Iraq in the 1780s, it didn't really matter that much whether you're Christian or Muslim or Sunni or Shia. It mattered whether you were rich or poor, whether you lived in the city or in the countryside, whether your father was a member of the Ba'ath Party. It didn't mean that of course, there were jokes about Christians, and there were moments when I felt that I was a minority. But it didn't mean that I couldn't go to university. It didn't mean that I couldn't go to church if I wanted to. So, I mean, this is the $1 trillion question that the world deals with everywhere. Now in India, it's the same problem. Or even in the United States. where, 3 out of every 4 voters in Virginia are born-again Christians. So it's just that it's not something that's particularly exclusive to Islamic traditions.
Good. Fair enough. Okay, so one last question that I have for you is about the idea of Iraq, where we now think of, when we think of Iraq, I mean, we think about dictatorships and military occupation and wars and refugees. And when we know that, I mean, we also know that Iraq is also associated with the beginning of civilization, the beginning of writing, mythologies. So what do you think, like, what's going to happen now? Is there a possibility of that region, that part, that country going back to its ancient glory or whatever?
No, I mean, that's a great question. And a lot of young Iraqis, which is human nature, I guess, look at the country's history and try to hold on into something and there is hope, because there was hope in 2019.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of young Iraqi men and women protested, and their primary slogan was no to sectarianism, no to corruption, Iraqi first. And so there is always hope. But sadly, I have to go back to collateral damage, and then, wars take so long to heal the structural damage. And with Iraq, it's in 1991, I always have to say this. James Baker, the Foreign Secretary of the United States, said, quote, "We bombed them back to the pre-industrial age," which is a very barbaric statement. But when you bomb a country that's not a superpower or not a member of the G8, when you bomb a third world developing country back to the pre-industrial age and destroy 114, it takes so long. And then there were sanctions, and then we go back to the geopolitics. So Iraq is a hostage between Iran and the United States, and whatever one may think, and I was always against the Saddam Hussein regime. My first novel is about a prisoner under Saddam Hussein. So I was never pro-dictatorship, but the United States went into 2003, and it not only removed Saddam Hussein, but it dismantled an entire state, a state and its institutions that took 90 years to build.
Yeah.
I mean, when I look at this hotel, it says inaugurated in 1948 after independence, and it takes so many humans and so much work and effort to build a state. The United States dismantled it and brought mostly people, incompetent criminals who were in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and London and Washington, brought them back into the country. And now, after 20 years, we have $700 billion that are missing, and corruption and violence. So I don't want to be totally pessimistic. Also, this uprising the crackdown was very violent. A lot of young men and women were killed. So it's a cruel world, and as we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt, unfortunately, protests are also hijacked by fundamentalism or by, frankly, Western powers who turn them into civil wars, because civil wars are easier to control than peaceful demonstrations. And we see what happened in Syria. I mean, we see the succession of, yes, we want him to go, no, we don't want him to go, and then now they're all having a rapprochement with. So one last thing I say, we have to always be wary how one dictator becomes all of a sudden a pariah, rightly so, but then he is taken back into, well, we have to deal with the devil we know, the devil we don't know. But I always, to quote another Palestinian novelist, one has to be a pessimist, or to quote Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, because the people living around the world, they have no choice but to try to change the situation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we have about 10 minutes left for questions. So, yeah, sure, please. Go ahead. I think we'll just give you a mic.
Thank you for the talk. This is the second time I've listened to you because I was there at the Lahore Literature Festival when you visited there. So I was lucky enough to grab a copy of your book, The Corpse Washer. But are there more, other books here at the bookshop outside? Because I didn't find them in the morning. Did you bring them with yourself just to check?
I brought copies. I'll give you one because you are a loyal reader, so I will reward you. No. It's okay. It's on me this time, but thank you. I don't think they have. If you didn't see them, they don't have them. Unfortunately.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Thank you to you, and thank you to you, Farah Zia. Could you recite some of your Arabic poetry for us? Just something short. We'd love you to get a sense.
Oh,
and
that
if
would
you
be
could
lovely. That would be lovely. Just a short one. Yeah.
And a summarized translation later.
Sure, I would love to. حين مزقتني الحرب أخذت ريشة مبللة بالموت ورسمت على جدار الحرب نافذة وفتحتها لكني أبصرت حربا أخرى وأما تخيط كفنا لشهيد ما زال في رحمها. Unfortunately, the poem that I remember the most is the saddest poem.
Oh.
When I was torn by war, I took a brush and I drew a window on the war's wall. And I opened it searching for something. But all I saw was another war and a mother weaving a shroud for the dead man in her womb.
Beautiful. One or two questions? Please.
I was curious about the poetic freedom the Old Testament gave you, because you mentioned using that in your poem.
No, thank you. That's a great question. Not poetic freedom. I mean, there have been poets, as is the case always, I think, in so-called world literature. The scriptures are always an iconic text to be inspired by or to play with. But with all of the recent debates about the divine being and what the divine being wants us to do in this world and the politicization of everything, and me, frankly, growing up as a secular atheist, but from a Christian family, so for a very long time, I distanced myself from all of that. But in getting older and hopefully more mature, even though I'm not a believer, but I understand and admire faith and spirituality. But this Old Testament and these notions about beginnings and endings, and frankly also the notion of a God who dies and then is resurrected. I mean, in this subcontinent, we know so much about that. And then learning that actually Jesus was not the first, and there are so many similar. So all of that, and I had read the Old Testament when I was much younger, but it just spoke to me in terms of dealing with these moments, and frankly also dealing with mortality as I get older, but as I see so many people die. And in Arabic, it's not as, because the Quran is the major text, even for Christians, because if Arabic is your mother tongue, the Quran is the book, and then there are the mu'allaqat. But the Old Testament, a few Christian Arab poets had played around with that, but not much. So I just thought there is more to be played with, especially in terms of in the beginning, but the beginning not of anything, the beginning of a wound and of suffering. Although your question is about the Old Testament, but I just remembered how in the book of Collateral Damage, I, for example, also am in conversation with Attar and the Conference of the Birds, because for